The story of Gideon, a journey of faith and courage. The story of Gideon, one of the judges of Israel, unfolds during a dark time in the history of God's chosen people. The Israelites were oppressed by the Midianites, a nomadic people who raided their lands and crops. This oppression lasted for 7 years, and the Israelites, weakened and fearful, cried out to God for deliverance. God, in His mercy, called upon a seemingly unlikely hero, a man named Gideon, to lead his people to victory. This story is one of faith, obedience, and divine intervention. Gideon's call. The sun had set over the valley of Jezreel, and the shadows stretched long over the land. In the quiet village of Ophrah, a young man named Gideon was quietly threshing wheat in a wine press, hiding from the Midianite soldiers who would regularly raid the land. It was a task meant for open fields, but fear drove him to take shelter in the secluded press. As he worked, a figure appeared before him. The angel of the Lord stood under an oak tree and called out, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon, startled and confused, looked around, wondering if the angel was speaking to someone else. "Pardon me, my Lord," he said, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all the wonders our ancestors told us about? Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The angel replied with a message of hope and commission, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" Gideon, still uncertain of his calling, questioned the angel. He was from the weakest tribe of Manasseh and the least in his family. How could he possibly be the one to deliver Israel? The Lord reassured him, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." Gideon's doubt and God's assurance. Though the Lord's words were clear, Gideon remained doubtful. "If I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me," he requested. The angel agreed, and Gideon went inside to prepare an offering. He brought back a young goat, unleavened bread, and a pot of broth. The angel instructed him to place the food on a rock and pour the broth over it. Then, the angel touched the offering with the tip of his staff, and fire sprang up from the rock, consuming the offering. Gideon, overwhelmed with awe and fear, realized he had seen the angel of the Lord. He feared for his life, thinking that seeing God face to face meant certain death. But the Lord comforted him, "Peace. Do not be afraid. You are not going to die." In response, Gideon built an altar to the Lord and named it "The Lord is Peace." The destruction of Baal's altar. God gave Gideon further instructions. He told him to tear down the altar of Baal, the false god worshipped by the people, and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Gideon was to build an altar to the Lord on the high ground, offering a sacrifice to him. Because Gideon was afraid of the people in his town, he did as God commanded, but at night. When the people of Ophrah woke the next morning, they discovered the altar of Baal had been destroyed, and the Asherah pole had been cut down. In its place was a new altar to the Lord. The people were furious and demanded that Gideon be brought to them. When they found out it was Gideon who had done it, they wanted to kill him. But his father, Joash, defended him. "If Baal is a god, let him defend himself," he said. "Why should you be upset with Gideon? If Baal is truly powerful, let him contend with Gideon." The people were silenced, and from that day, Gideon was called Jerubbaal, meaning "let Baal contend." The fleece test. Gideon's faith, though strengthened, still wavered. He asked God for another sign, seeking assurance that the Lord truly intended to use him to deliver Israel. Gideon placed a fleece of wool on the ground and prayed, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand." That night, God did as Gideon asked. The fleece was wet with dew, but the ground around it remained dry. Despite this clear sign, Gideon was still unsure, and he asked God for one more test. "Do not be angry with me," he said, "but let me make one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece. This time, make the fleece dry and the ground covered with dew." The Lord granted his request, and the next morning, the fleece was dry, but the ground was covered with dew. Gideon's faith was finally confirmed, and he was ready to step forward. The army of 300. The time had come for Gideon to gather the Israelites and lead them into battle against the Midianites. He sent out messengers to call the people to arms, and soon 32,000 men assembled. But God had a different plan. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men for me to deliver Midian into their hands. In order that Israel may not boast against me that her own strength has saved her, announce to the people, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead." Gideon did as instructed, and 22,000 men turned back, leaving him with only 10,000. But God said again, "There are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you." So, Gideon took the men to the water, and God instructed him to separate them based on how they drank. Those who lapped the water with their tongues like dogs were set aside, and those who knelt down to drink were kept. Only 300 men lapped the water like dogs. The Lord told Gideon, "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." Gideon's army had been reduced from 32,000 to just 300, but this was the number God had chosen to demonstrate his power. The victory over Midian. God gave Gideon further instructions. He was to go to the Midianite camp and listen to what the enemy soldiers were saying. Gideon and his servant, Parah, crept into the camp, where they overheard a Midianite soldier telling a dream. In the dream, a loaf of barley bread rolled into the Midianite camp and struck a tent, causing it to collapse. The soldier interpreted the dream as a sign that God had given Gideon victory over Midian. Encouraged by this, Gideon returned to his men and divided them into 3 groups. He gave each man a trumpet, an empty jar, and a torch to hide inside the jar. At Gideon's signal, they blew their trumpets, broke the jars to reveal the torches, and shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." The Midianites were thrown into confusion, and in the chaos, they began fighting each other. The 300 Israelites pursued them, and with God's help, they defeated the Midianite army. The enemy fled, and the Israelites were freed from their oppression. The legacy of Gideon. Gideon was offered the role of king by the people, but he refused, saying, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." Gideon's victory marked the end of 7 years of Midianite oppression. He led Israel in peace for many years, but eventually, the people turned away from God, and the cycle of sin, oppression, and deliverance began again. The story of Gideon is one of the greatest examples of how God uses unlikely people to accomplish his purposes. Gideon's journey from fear and doubt to faith and victory serves as a reminder that God's power is made perfect in weakness. Through Gideon, God showed that even a small, seemingly insignificant group can triumph when they trust in him. The legacy of Gideon is not just in his victory over Midian, but in his obedience to God, even when the odds seemed impossible. It is a story of faith, courage, and the unwavering presence of God in the lives of his people.